On the morning of July 17th, 1955, a 53-year-old man in a business suit stood at the entrance of something that did not yet have a name in the world. Not really. There were amusement parks. There were fairs. There were carnivals and boardwalks and pleasure grounds of every description. But there was no word yet for what Walt Disney had built on 160 acres of former orange groves in Anaheim, California, because nothing like it had existed before. Disney called it a theme park, and the term was new enough that most journalists writing about it that day put it in quotation marks, as if they were not entirely sure the category was real. By the end of that single day, a day of catastrophic operational failures, overwhelming crowds, broken rides, melting asphalt, and a live television broadcast watched by an estimated 90 million Americans, the word would mean something specific and permanent. And the place it described would go on to become the most visited theme park on Earth, the foundation of a global entertainment empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and a permanent fixture in the imagination of every generation born after 1955. But on the morning of July 17th, none of that had happened yet. The gates were closed. The rides were untested at scale. The concrete was still curing in some of the walkways. And Walt Disney was standing at the entrance of a dream that was about to meet reality for the first time. To understand what Disneyland was when it opened, you have to understand what it was not. It was not born from the amusement park industry. Walt Disney did not look at Coney Island or the State Fair Midway and decide to build a better version. He looked at them and decided to build something categorically different, something that solved, as he saw it, every problem those places had. The amusement parks of the early 1950s were, in Disney's view and in the view of many middle-class American families, places of dubious character. They were associated with carnivals and traveling shows, with grime and the faint smell of danger, with barkers running rigged games, with rides that looked structurally questionable, with food of uncertain origin sold by strangers of uncertain reliability. They were not places where a father could take his children and feel confident that everything around him was clean, safe, honest, and appropriate. Disney, who had taken his own daughters to amusement parks and sat on benches watching them ride the merry-go-round while he felt obscurely dissatisfied with the experience, wanted something different. He wanted a place where the father enjoyed himself as much as the children, where the environment was controlled and beautiful, where the stories his studio had been telling on film for 20 years could be walked through, inhabited, experienced rather than merely watched. The idea gestated for years before it became a project, and the project nearly destroyed him financially before it opened. The original estimate for building Disneyland was approximately $4.5 million. The final cost, by the time the gates opened on July 17, 1955, was closer to $17 million, a sum that required Disney to borrow against his life insurance policy, sell his vacation home, and enter into a partnership with the ABC television network that exchanged construction funding for a weekly television program. The program was called Disneyland, the same name as the park, and it served simultaneously as a financing mechanism and a marketing vehicle. Each week's episode promoting the park and its themed lands to the American television audience, building anticipation for a place that did not yet exist. By the time the park opened, millions of Americans felt they already knew Disneyland. They had watched it being built on television. They had seen the concept art and the architectural models. They had watched Walt Disney himself walk through the orange groves in Anaheim, pointing at empty air and describing what would be there. The marketing and the construction were the same project. The site chosen for Disneyland was Anaheim, in Orange County, California, then a predominantly agricultural area about 25 miles southeast of Los Angeles. Disney's location consultants, led by the Stanford Research Institute, analyzed dozens of potential sites before recommending Anaheim. The key factors were the recent completion of the Santa Ana Freeway connecting Anaheim to Los Angeles, the availability of large flat parcels of affordable agricultural land, and the favorable Southern California climate that allowed outdoor operation almost year-round. Disney purchased 160 acres of orange and walnut groves in the fall of 1953. The trees were cleared, the land was graded, and construction began in the summer of 1954. 11 months of construction, an extraordinarily compressed timeline for a project of this scale and complexity, separated the groundbreaking from the opening day. The design of Disneyland reflected principles that Disney had developed over years of thinking about the problem of the amusement park, and those principles were radical enough that the construction industry professionals hired to build the place frequently argued with him about them. The park was organized around a central hub, the plaza at the end of Main Street, from which four distinct themed lands radiated like spokes from a wheel. Main Street, itself, was the entry sequence, a recreation of an idealized small American town of the turn of the 20th century, lined with shops and restaurants on both sides, designed at 5/8 scale to create a sense of intimacy and approachability while still feeling grand. At the end of Main Street, the Sleeping Beauty Castle, a confection of blue and gold spires inspired by Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, marked the transition to Fantasyland Beyond. To the left of the hub was Adventureland, with its jungle and colonial outpost aesthetic. To the right was Tomorrowland, imagining the world of the future. And straight through the castle, beyond the hub, Frontierland extended along the banks of the rivers of America, a man-made waterway large enough to sail a replica steamboat. The principle of visual containment, hiding the outside world from the guests inside, was one of Disney's most insistent design requirements and one of the most difficult to achieve on a flat site in the middle of an orange-growing district. At parks like Coney Island, the surrounding city was always visible. You could look over the fence and see the urban reality that the park was supposed to provide an escape from. Disney wanted his park to be total. Once you were inside, you should be inside, surrounded by the designed environment on every side, with no glimpse of a parking lot or a highway or a telephone pole to break the spell. On a flat site, this required building up the park's perimeter, a berm, essentially a long, low hill that ringed the entire property and blocked sight lines to the world outside. The berm was one of the first things constructed. It was not a glamorous piece of engineering. It was a mound of dirt, but it was essential to the fundamental experience Disney was trying to create, the experience of complete immersion in a designed world with no visible connection to ordinary reality. The construction team that built Disneyland in 11 months was operating under conditions of extreme pressure, constantly changing specifications, and the particular challenge of building things that had never been built before. The Jungle Cruise required a man-made river system with a controlled water supply and mechanical animals. Hippos and elephants and crocodiles built by Disney's own studio technicians, creatures that had to move convincingly in water without electrical systems that would be damaged by submersion. The Mark Twain riverboat, a full-scale replica of a Mississippi River steamboat, required a channel deep enough and wide enough to navigate. Dug by hand and lined with concrete in the middle of what had recently been an orange grove. The Matterhorn, the iconic artificial mountain, was not yet built in 1955, but the construction challenges it represented were being encountered in miniature on every other attraction. Everything was custom. Nothing was off the shelf. The people building Disneyland were inventing the vocabulary of theme park engineering as they went. By the evening of July 16, 1955, the night before opening day, the park was not ready. This is not a retrospective assessment made with the benefit of hindsight. It was obvious at the time to everyone present. Paint was still wet on some of the building facades along Main Street. The asphalt in several areas of the park had been poured so recently that it had not fully cured, a problem that would become dramatically apparent the following day when the Southern California summer heat softened it enough for women's high heels to sink in and become trapped. Some of the attractions were still being tested and calibrated. The food service infrastructure, the kitchens, the supply chains, the staffing, had been planned for a specific number of guests and was about to encounter a number considerably larger. Disney himself, by multiple accounts, barely slept that night. He walked the park in the early morning hours, checking, adjusting, worrying. He had spent 4 years and $17 million on this day, and the day had not yet proven whether any of it would work. The invitation for opening day specified a guest list of around 6,000 people, press, dignitaries, studio employees, ABC television personnel, and their families. The invitations had been carefully controlled. What had not been controlled was counterfeiting. By the morning of July 17th, it became clear that forged invitations had been produced and distributed on a significant scale. The actual number of people who entered Disneyland on its opening day has been estimated at between 28,000 and 33,000, between 4 and 5 times the intended capacity. The ticket booths were overwhelmed before the park had been open an hour. The food vendors ran out of supplies by early afternoon. The lines for the most popular attractions stretched to lengths that meant guests waited for hours for rides that lasted minutes. The drinking fountains, which had been a point of particular pride in Disney's original design, he had insisted that water be available everywhere and free, ran dry or malfunctioned in several areas, a failure attributed to a plumber strike that forced Disney to choose between working restrooms and working drinking fountains. He had chosen the restrooms. By midday, in the Anaheim summer heat, guests who could not find water were not pleased. The live television broadcast that ABC was transmitting to 90 million American homes was, simultaneously, one of the most important events in American broadcasting history and a logistical nightmare of the first order. The broadcast was hosted by 3 men rotating through various positions around the park: Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, and a 32-year-old television personality named Ronald Reagan, who was then the host of the General Electric Theater and not yet a politician of any description. The 3 hosts moved through the park with cameras following them, conducting interviews, narrating the scenes unfolding around them, attempting to convey the excitement and wonder of the opening day. They were working with 17 cameras, more cameras than had ever been used simultaneously in a live American television broadcast. The technical complexity was extraordinary. Cables ran across walkways. Camera operators competed with the overcrowded guests for position. The heat was affecting both the equipment and the people operating it. The rides themselves performed with mixed results on opening day. The horse-drawn streetcars on Main Street worked smoothly. The Mark Twain riverboat worked, and was by most accounts one of the genuine successes of the day, its passengers crowding the railings for views of the jungle and frontier scenery on the riverbanks. The jungle cruise worked, though the mechanical animals performed with varying degrees of convincingness. Several attractions experienced technical failures of various kinds: stalls, jams, mechanical issues that required temporary closure. The attraction that would have been the most spectacular, if it had been working, was the Flying Dumbo ride, which suffered a fuel leak and could not operate at all. Guests who had come specifically to ride Dumbo found it roped off with no explanation. The park's first day was, by the standards of what Disneyland would become, chaotic, underprepared, and in several respects embarrassing. Disney, watching from various vantage points throughout the day, was by multiple accounts alternately excited and mortified. The press coverage of opening day was correspondingly mixed. The journalists who had been invited, and who had received genuine invitations rather than counterfeits, wrote about the spectacle, the ambition, the unprecedented nature of what Disney had built. They also wrote about the lines, the heat, the food shortages, the broken fountains, and the general sense of a project that had opened before it was entirely ready. One journalist, writing for a major newspaper, described the day as Black Sunday, a phrase that Disney found painful enough that he reportedly kept the clipping and referred to it in discussions of how the park had improved in the months following opening. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Opening day at Disneyland was, by the operational standards Disney had set for himself, a failure. By almost every other standard, attendance, media coverage, public excitement, the sheer fact of having built and opened a completely new kind of place, it was a beginning. Within weeks of opening day, the problems had been largely corrected. The food supply chains were adjusted for actual attendance levels rather than projected ones. The mechanical systems of the attractions were debugged through the accumulated experience of operating them with real guests. The staffing was recalibrated. Disney himself walked the park constantly in the weeks after opening, watching guests, taking notes, identifying what worked and what didn't with the same analytical attention he brought to the production of his films. He was not a man who accepted a first draft as a final product. Disneyland, he famously said, would never be completed. It would continue to grow and improve as long as there was imagination left in the world and money left in the operation. The statement was part philosophy and part business plan, but it was also simply accurate. The park that existed in August 1955 was already different from the park that had opened in July. And the park of 1956 will be different still. The first year's attendance figures demolished every projection that Disney and his financial backers had made. By the end of 1955, more than 1 million guests had visited Disneyland. By the end of 1956, the number had exceeded 3 million. The park was profitable almost immediately, a result that surprised the entertainment industry, the financial community, and the amusement park industry in roughly equal measure. The people who had told Disney his idea was foolish, that no one would pay to walk through a park based on cartoon characters, that the project would bankrupt him and embarrass his studio. Those people were now watching the attendance figures and revising their assessments. The revenue from Disneyland did not merely sustain itself. It began to fund the further development of the Walt Disney Company in ways that would eventually transform the company from a film studio into something much larger and stranger and more powerful. What opened on July 17, 1955 in Anaheim, California, was a broken, overcrowded, asphalt melting, fountain failing, Dumbo grounded, Forge ticket flooded, 90 million television viewers watching dream of a place that worked, despite everything, because the idea underneath the operational chaos was genuinely new. Walt Disney had understood something that no one in the entertainment industry had quite articulated before, that people did not only want to watch stories. They wanted to be inside them. They wanted to walk through the world that the story described, to smell it and hear it, and touch the surfaces of its buildings, to feel themselves participants rather than audience members. The rides were secondary to that insight. The food and the merchandise and the carefully trained staff were in service of that insight. The berm that hid the outside world and the castle at the end of Main Street and the 5/8 scale of the storefronts. All of it was in service of that single, radical, enormously profitable insight. You could sell immersion. You could sell the feeling of being somewhere else entirely. And if you did it well enough, people would come back again and again because the somewhere else you had built was better, cleaner, safer, more beautiful, more emotionally resonant than the somewhere they had come from. On July 17, 1955, that insight opened its gates for the first time. It has not closed them since.